In the dead of winter, 1943, when most people were huddled around fires dreaming of better days, one woman was crawling through frozen mud toward the most heavily guarded fortress in occupied territory. Her breath formed deadly clouds in the frigid air, each exhale potentially giving away her position to the dozens of enemy soldiers patrolling above. She carried nothing but a modified rifle, 3 bullets, and a piece of intelligence that could save thousands of lives or cost her everything. What she discovered inside those concrete walls wasn't just enemy positions or stolen supplies. It was something far more sinister, a conspiracy so deadly that even her own commanders had become targets. By the time she realized the true scope of the betrayal, escape routes had been cut off, communications severed, and she found herself completely alone against an entire garrison of trained killers. This is the untold story of Katerina Volkov, a woman whose impossible mission became a fight for survival that lasted 3 days and changed the course of an entire war. What you're about to read isn't just another war story. It's the account of how one person's courage exposed a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of command, and how her deadly accuracy with a rifle became the only thing standing between victory and catastrophe. Katerina Volkov pressed herself against the frozen earth, her body becoming one with the shadows cast by the towering pine trees. The fortress loomed before her like a concrete monster, its searchlights sweeping across the snow-covered ground in mechanical patterns she had memorized over the past week of observation. Each beam of light represented death if she miscalculated even by seconds. The wind howled through the mountains, carrying with it the distant sound of German voices and the metallic clank of weapons being cleaned. She had been lying motionless for over 4 hours waiting for the guard rotation that happened every 6 hours like clockwork. Her breath came in controlled, shallow puffs that dissipated quickly in the bitter cold. The temperature had dropped to -20 degrees, but Katerina felt nothing. Her body had been trained to endure conditions that would kill ordinary soldiers. She was not an ordinary soldier. At 26 years old, Katerina had already become a legend among the resistance fighters scattered across the occupied territories. Her reputation was built on impossible shots taken at distances that shouldn't have been achievable with standard military equipment. But Katerina didn't use standard equipment. The rifle strapped to her back had been modified by a brilliant engineer who had died protecting the very intelligence she was now risking everything to recover. The intelligence was more than just enemy troop movements or supply line information. According to the dying words of Commander Pavel Antonov, there was evidence inside the fortress that would expose a conspiracy reaching the highest levels of the resistance command structure. Someone was feeding information to the enemy. Someone trusted enough to know about planned operations weeks in advance. The betrayal had already cost hundreds of lives, and if left unchecked, it would destroy everything they had fought to build. Katerina's mission was supposed to be simple. Infiltrate the fortress, locate the intelligence cache hidden in the communications bunker, and extract the evidence without being detected. The plan relied on her ability to remain invisible, to move through enemy territory like a ghost. But plans, even the best ones, rarely survived contact with reality. The searchlights swept past her position again, and in the brief moment of darkness that followed, Katerina moved. She covered 50 meters in complete silence, her body flowing across the frozen ground like water. Every step was calculated, every movement economical. She had practiced this approach dozens of times on similar terrain, but never with stakes this high. The outer perimeter of the fortress consisted of 3 layers of defense. The first was a simple wire fence, electrified but poorly maintained due to the harsh weather conditions. Katerina had spent days studying the electrical patterns, noting the moments when power fluctuations occurred. She reached the fence just as one of these fluctuations dimmed the warning lights, indicating a temporary drop in voltage. Using insulated cutters, she opened a gap large enough to crawl through. The second layer was more challenging. Guard towers positioned every 100 meters provided overlapping fields of observation, manned by soldiers equipped with night vision equipment. But technology had weaknesses, and Katerina knew how to exploit them. The night vision devices used by the German forces had limited range in extreme cold, and their effectiveness was reduced by the heavy snowfall that had begun an hour earlier. She waited in the shadows between 2 towers, timing the movements of the guards. Each sentry followed a predictable pattern, turning left for 30 seconds, then right for 30 seconds, then scanning the center area for 15 seconds before repeating the cycle. Katerina counted the rotation silently, her internal clock synchronized with their movements. On the 7th cycle, when both guards turned away simultaneously, she sprinted across the open ground. The third layer was the most dangerous. Motion sensors had been placed throughout the inner courtyard, devices sensitive enough to detect the movement of small animals. But Katerina had learned from the local wildlife. She moved like a hunting cat, freezing completely whenever the sensors swept in her direction, then flowing forward during the brief gaps in coverage. It took her almost an hour to cross a space that could normally be traversed in minutes. The main building of the fortress was a converted monastery, its ancient stone walls now reinforced with steel plates and concrete barriers. Gothic windows had been bricked up and replaced with narrow gun ports, giving the structure the appearance of a medieval castle designed for modern warfare. Katerina approached from the north side, where a collapsed section of the original wall created a natural blind spot in the defensive coverage. She scaled the 30-foot wall using climbing techniques learned from mountain fighters who had operated in these same mountains for generations. Her gloved hands found purchase on seemingly smooth stone, her feet locating ledges invisible to anyone unfamiliar with this type of climbing. The stone was slick with ice, making every grip potentially fatal, but Katerina's confidence never wavered. Reaching the top of the wall, she paused to survey the inner courtyard. The intelligence briefings had been accurate. Guard positions were exactly where expected. Patrol routes followed the patterns described in stolen documents. But there was something else. Something that made her instincts scream danger. Too many vehicles in the motor pool. Too many lights burning in windows that should have been dark. Too much activity for a routine night at a remote fortress. She checked her watch. 2:30 in the morning. The communications bunker would be lightly staffed at this hour, possibly with only a single operator monitoring radio traffic. The bunker was located in the basement of the main building, accessible through a service entrance that connected to the old monastery's wine cellars. Getting there required crossing 40 meters of open courtyard and descending 2 flights of stone steps. Katerina dropped silently into the courtyard, landing in a crouch behind a stack of supply crates. She could hear German voices coming from the main building, more conversation than there should have been in the middle of the night. Through a partially covered window, she glimpsed soldiers gathered around a radio, their faces tense with concentration. Whatever they were listening to, it had their complete attention. Moving from cover to cover, she reached the service entrance without being detected. The door was secured with a simple lock, the kind that could be bypassed by someone with the proper training. Katerina had that training, and more. She had the door open in less than 60 seconds. The wine cellars were exactly as described in the intelligence briefings. Stone corridors lined with empty wine racks led deeper into the building's foundation. Emergency lighting provided just enough illumination to navigate without using her flashlight. The air was thick with the smell of damp stone and something else, something that made her pause and test the atmosphere carefully. The smell was cordite, the distinctive odor left by recently fired weapons. Someone had been shooting in these tunnels within the past few hours. That wasn't part of any intelligence report she had received. Guards didn't conduct target practice in basement tunnels, especially not in the middle of the night. She drew her sidearm and continued forward, every sense alert for danger. The communications bunker should be just ahead, through a reinforced door marked with German military symbols. But as she approached the final corner, she heard something that made her blood freeze. Voices speaking Russian, not German soldiers talking about Russian prisoners. Russian voices, speaking in the dialect of her own region, discussing operational details that only resistance commanders should have known. She pressed herself against the stone wall and listened, her mind racing to process what she was hearing. The voices were coordinating an operation scheduled for the following week, an operation she recognized because she had been part of the planning committee. They were discussing troop positions, supply caches, and communication codes that had been classified at the highest levels. But they weren't discussing how to defend against these operations. They were planning how to ensure they would fail. Katerina realized with growing horror that she hadn't just stumbled into an enemy fortress. She had walked into the headquarters of the conspiracy that had been destroying the resistance from within. The intelligence she had come to recover wasn't hidden in this bunker. It was being created here, by traitors who had been feeding information to the enemy for months. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the stone corridor. Multiple sets of boots moving with military precision toward her position. She had perhaps 30 seconds before they rounded the corner and discovered her. In 30 seconds, her infiltration mission would become a battle for survival against enemies who knew exactly who she was and why she had come. Katerina checked her weapons and prepared to fight her way out. The conspiracy was deeper and more dangerous than anyone had suspected, but she was still alive. And as long as she remained alive, there was hope that the truth could still be exposed. The mission had changed, but her determination had only grown stronger. The footsteps were getting closer. It was time to discover just how good she really was, when the odds were impossible, and retreat was not an option. The real battle was about to begin. The first soldier rounded the corner just as Katerina pressed herself into an alcove that had once held wine barrels. His flashlight beam swept across the stone walls, missing her position by inches. She could see his face clearly now, and recognition hit her like a physical blow. Viktor Petrov, a resistance commander who had supposedly died in a German ambush 3 weeks earlier. The same Viktor who had personally briefed her on this mission before his reported death. Behind Viktor came 2 more men she recognized. Captain Boris Mikhailov and Lieutenant Alex Volsky, both trusted members of the resistance leadership. All 3 men wore German uniforms, but their weapons were Russian-made, and they moved with the confidence of people operating in friendly territory. The pieces of the conspiracy were falling into place with terrifying clarity. Viktor stopped just outside our hiding place and spoke quietly into a radio. "Base, this is Hunter Team. We've completed the sweep of sectors 7 through 12. No sign of our visitor yet, but she's definitely in the building. The motion sensors picked up her entry 20 minutes ago." The radio crackled with a response in accented Russian. "Understood, Hunter Team. Remember, we need her alive if possible. She knows too much about our operations to be allowed to escape, but her information could be valuable. Continue the search." Katerina's mind raced. They knew she was here. Worse, they had been expecting her. This entire mission had been a trap from the beginning, designed to eliminate the one person whose skills posed a serious threat to their operation. But they had made one crucial mistake. They assumed she would try to avoid confrontation, to remain hidden until she could escape. They didn't expect her to go on the attack. She waited until the 3 men had moved past her position, then emerged silently from the alcove. Viktor was bringing up the rear, his attention focused on the corridor ahead. Katerina moved like a predator, closing the distance in absolute silence. Her knife found the gap between his helmet and body armor, sliding between vertebrae with surgical precision. Viktor dropped, without making a sound. The other 2 men continued forward, unaware that their companion was no longer following. Katerina dragged Viktor's body into the shadows and quickly searched his equipment. What she found confirmed her worst fears. The radio was set to frequencies used only by the highest levels of resistance command. Viktor carried documents bearing the signatures of commanders she had trusted with her life. Most damning of all, he had a detailed map of resistance safe houses, supply caches, and operational plans scheduled for the next 6 months. The scope of the betrayal was staggering. This wasn't just a few corrupt officers selling information to the enemy. This was a complete infiltration of the resistance leadership, a systematic dismantling of everything they had built. The Germans weren't just fighting the resistance. They had captured it, turned it into a weapon against itself. Katerina moved deeper into the bunker complex, following signs that led toward the communications center. She needed to find the source of the conspiracy, to identify who was controlling this operation. Along the way, she passed rooms filled with equipment that should never have existed in a German fortress. Russian radio sets, resistance codes, and ciphers, detailed maps of territories that were supposedly under resistance control. In one room, she discovered files containing the personal information of every resistance fighter in the region. Names, addresses, family members, operational histories, psychological profiles. The level of detail was extraordinary, far beyond what could have been gathered through casual interrogation or captured documents. This information could only have come from someone with unlimited access to resistance records. The communications center was located at the heart of the bunker complex, behind multiple layers of security that had been designed to keep people out, not in. But someone had been careless. The final security door was propped open, held in place by a communications cable that had been recently installed. Through the gap, Katerina could hear voices engaged in animated conversation. She positioned herself where she could observe the room without being seen. What she witnessed made her understand the true scope of the disaster that had befallen the resistance. The communications center wasn't being operated by German technicians. It was staffed by resistance officers she had served alongside for years, people she had trusted enough to share meals and stories with during long winter nights in hidden camps. At the center of the operation sat Colonel Dmitry Kozlov, the man who had recruited Katerina into the resistance 3 years earlier, the man who had trained her, guided her development as a marksman, and personally selected her for the most dangerous missions. He was speaking calmly into a radio microphone, coordinating operations across multiple fronts with the efficiency of someone who had been doing this job for a very long time. Tiger Base, this is Control. Confirm that the supply drop to Sector 4 has been intercepted. The weapons should be in German hands within the next 2 hours. His voice was calm, professional, completely devoid of any emotion that might indicate guilt or conflict about what he was doing. The radio responded immediately. Control, Tiger Base, confirmed. German forces were in position as scheduled. Resistance team believed they were under attack and scattered as planned. Estimate 30% casualties, no survivors with knowledge of the supply route. Katerina felt sick. Sector 4 was where her friend Maria Volkov had been leading a supply mission. 30% casualties meant at least a dozen resistance fighters were dead or captured, killed by an operation their own commanders had orchestrated. Maria might be among them, betrayed by people she had served faithfully for years. Colonel Kozlov continued his coordination, moving from one operation to another with mechanical precision. Each radio call represented another betrayal, another group of resistance fighters being led into carefully prepared ambushes. The resistance wasn't losing the war because the Germans were superior fighters. They were losing because their own leadership was systematically destroying them from within. But why? What could possibly motivate veteran resistance fighters to turn against everything they had fought for? Katerina moved closer to the door, straining to hear more of the conversation. The answer came from an unexpected source. A new voice entered the conversation, speaking German with a thick accent. Colonel Kozlov, this is General Heinrich Müller. I want to personally congratulate you on the success of Operation Judas. The intelligence you have provided has exceeded our most optimistic expectations. The Führer himself has expressed satisfaction with your results. Kozlov responded in fluent German, his accent perfect. Thank you, General. But I want to remind you that our agreement was specific. Once the resistance has been eliminated, my people are to be given the autonomous region we discussed. We're not doing this to become German citizens. We're doing this to create our own nation. The pieces suddenly fit together. This wasn't simple treachery motivated by money or coercion. This was a calculated political gamble. Kozlov and his conspirators believed they could use German victory to carve out their own territory, free from both German and Soviet control. They were willing to sacrifice thousands of their own people for the chance to become rulers of whatever remained. General Müller's response was cold and businesslike. Of course, Colonel. The Reich honors its agreements with useful allies. Once the final resistance strongholds have been eliminated, we will discuss the establishment of your autonomous region. But first, we must deal with the immediate threat. Our intelligence suggests that someone has discovered your operation. A female marksman who has been causing significant problems for our forces. Katerina Volkov, Kozlov said, and there was genuine regret in his voice. I trained her myself. She's the best marksman I've ever seen, and, unfortunately, she's completely incorruptible. She cannot be turned, and she's too dangerous to be allowed to live. But finding her won't be easy. I taught her too well. She's already been found, Muller replied. Our motion sensors detected her entry into the fortress 2 hours ago. Your people are conducting a search now. She'll be located within the next 30 minutes. Katerina realized that her time was running out. Soon, the entire fortress would be locked down, every exit blocked, every hiding place searched. But she had learned what she came to find. The conspiracy wasn't just about selling intelligence to the enemy. It was about creating a new political reality, with the conspirators positioning themselves as the rulers of a puppet state. More importantly, she now knew who could be trusted and who couldn't. Every name Kozlov had mentioned, every officer who had participated in the radio conversations, was now identified as a traitor. If she could escape and get this information to loyal resistance fighters, they could begin the process of rebuilding their organization around people who hadn't been compromised. But escape seemed impossible. The fortress was designed to keep people out, but it was equally effective at keeping people in. The searchlights, the guard towers, the motion sensors, all of the obstacles she had overcome during infiltration would be turned against her during any escape attempt. And now she would be facing them, while every soldier in the fortress was actively hunting for her. She needed a new plan, something that would create enough chaos and confusion to mask her escape. Looking around the communication center, an idea began to form. All of the resistance operations being coordinated from this room depended on precise timing and careful coordination. If that coordination were disrupted, if the communications network were to suddenly fail, the results could be spectacular. Katerina checked her equipment. She still had 3 explosive charges, originally intended for destroying the intelligence cache she had expected to find. The charges weren't powerful enough to bring down the entire bunker, but they could certainly destroy the communications equipment and create the distraction she needed. But using the explosives would alert every soldier in the fortress to her exact location. She would have perhaps 5 minutes before overwhelming force converged on her position. 5 minutes to get from the basement bunker to the fortress perimeter through multiple layers of security while under direct fire from experienced soldiers. The odds were impossible, but the alternative was certain death or capture. And if she was captured, the conspiracy would remain hidden. The resistance would continue to be systematically destroyed, and thousands more people would die in carefully orchestrated ambushes. Katerina began placing the explosive charges on the critical communication nodes, setting the timers for a synchronized detonation that would occur in exactly 10 minutes. 10 minutes to get ready for the most dangerous escape attempt of her career. 10 minutes before the real battle would begin. As she made final preparations, she could hear the search teams getting closer. Their voices echoed through the stone corridors, systematic and professional. They were good soldiers, following orders they believed were legitimate. They had no idea they were serving people who had betrayed everything they thought they were fighting for. Soon, everyone in the fortress would know exactly where she was and exactly what she had discovered. The time for stealth and infiltration was over. From now on, it would be pure combat, skill against skill, with survival as the only objective that mattered. The conspiracy was bigger and more dangerous than anyone had imagined. But Katerina Volkov was still alive, and as long as she remained alive, there was hope that the truth could still triumph over betrayal. The explosion shattered the underground silence like thunder in a cathedral. 3 simultaneous blasts tore through the communication center, sending shockwaves through the stone foundations and plunging entire sections of the fortress into darkness. Emergency lighting flickered to life as alarm bells began their urgent clanging, but the damage was already done. Years of carefully coordinated betrayal had been reduced to twisted metal and sparking cables in a matter of seconds. Katerina was already moving when the charges detonated. She had positioned herself at the far end of the corridor, protected from the blast but close enough to take advantage of the chaos that followed. The explosion had created more than just physical destruction. It had severed the communication links that allowed the conspiracy to coordinate operations across the entire region. Every treacherous order, every carefully planned ambush, every systematic betrayal was now cut off at the source. The first soldiers to respond came running down the stone steps 3 at a time, their boots echoing like gunshots in the confined space. They expected to find an intruder trapped by the explosion, possibly wounded, certainly disoriented. Instead, they found Katerina waiting for them with her rifle ready and a clear field of fire down the entire length of the corridor. Her first shot took the lead soldier in the chest, spinning him around and sending him tumbling back into his companions. The second shot came before the echo of the first had faded, catching the next man in the shoulder and dropping him to his knees. The third soldier managed to raise his weapon before Katerina's bullet found the gap in his helmet, ending his participation in the hunt permanently. She moved immediately. After firing, knowing that return fire would saturate her previous position within seconds. The stone walls that provided excellent protection also created a deadly trap for anyone who remained stationary too long. Ricochets could come from any angle, and the confined space amplified the destructive power of every shot fired. Moving through the basement levels, Katerina encountered the fortress's emergency response in full activation. Soldiers were running in every direction, some trying to reach the communication center, others attempting to establish perimeter security around potential escape routes. The explosion had created exactly the chaos she needed, but it had also aroused every defender in the fortress. She reached the main stairwell just as a squad of German soldiers was descending from the upper levels. 6 men in full combat gear, moving with the practiced efficiency of veterans. They saw her at the same moment she saw them, but Katerina's reaction time was faster. Her rifle spoke twice, taking down the point man and the soldier immediately behind him. The remaining 4 scattered for cover, but the narrow stairwell offered few options. A grenade clattered down the stone steps, its pin glinting in the emergency lighting. Katerina threw herself behind a stone pillar as the explosion filled the stairwell with shrapnel and dust. The blast was deafening in the confined space, but when the debris settled, she was still alive and still fighting. The German soldiers attempted to advance under cover of the smoke and dust, but Katerina had anticipated their tactics. She waited until they committed to movement, then emerged from cover with devastating effect. Her rifle found targets with mechanical precision, each shot carefully aimed and deliberately fatal. Within 30 seconds, the stairwell was silent again. But silence was temporary. Radio chatter from the dead soldiers' equipment indicated that reinforcements were already being deployed. Every exit from the fortress would soon be covered by multiple overlapping fields of fire. Guard towers were being reinforced, searchlights were being redirected to eliminate shadows, and additional patrols were being dispatched to sweep every possible hiding place. Katerina reached the main floor of the fortress and immediately realized that her original escape route was no longer viable. The courtyard was now illuminated like a sporting arena, with searchlights crisscrossing every inch of open ground. Guard positions had been reinforced with additional personnel, and new firing positions had been established to cover previously unguarded approaches. Through a window, she could see Colonel Kozlov himself directing the search effort. He was positioned in the main tower, protected by additional guards, coordinating the hunt for his former protégé with the same tactical brilliance that had once made him a legendary resistance commander. He knew her capabilities better than anyone, and he was using that knowledge to systematically eliminate her options. The radio at her feet crackled with Kozlov's voice. "All units, this is Control. The target is Katerina Volkov, female, 26-year-old, expert marksman and infiltration specialist. She is extremely dangerous and has already killed multiple personnel. Do not attempt to take her alive unless you have overwhelming tactical advantage. Shoot on sight." Hearing her own death warrant pronounced by the man who had been like a father to her filled Katerina with cold fury. The betrayal was personal as well as political. Kozlov hadn't just sold out the resistance for his dream of autonomous rule. He had been prepared to sacrifice her personally, knowing full well that this mission was a trap designed to eliminate her as a threat to his conspiracy. But fury was a luxury she couldn't afford. Survival required absolute focus and tactical thinking. She needed to analyze the fortress defenses from the perspective of someone trying to escape rather than infiltrate. Every strength could potentially be turned into a weakness if she could identify the right pressure points. The fortress had been designed around the assumption that attacks would come from outside. The defensive positions were oriented to repel external assault, with overlapping fields of fire focused on approaches from the surrounding terrain. But that same orientation created blind spots and vulnerabilities for someone already inside the defensive perimeter. Katerina made her way to the vehicle maintenance area, located in a converted section of the original monastery's stables. German military vehicles were parked in neat rows, but more importantly, this area connected directly to the main gate through a service road that bypassed most of the internal security checkpoints. If she could reach a vehicle and create enough of a distraction, she might be able to crash through the gate before the guards could organize effective resistance. The maintenance area was guarded, but not heavily. 2 soldiers were positioned at the main entrance, their attention focused on the courtyard where the primary search was taking place. Katerina approached from the side, moving through shadows that the searchlights couldn't penetrate. Her knife eliminated both guards silently, their bodies dragged into darkness where they wouldn't be discovered until the search moved to this section. She selected a motorcycle from among the parked vehicles, a machine designed for reconnaissance and messenger duties. It was fast, maneuverable, and most importantly, it could accelerate quickly enough to outrun the initial response to her escape attempt. The keys were hanging on a board near the maintenance tools, labeled and organized with typical German efficiency. The motorcycle started on the first try, its engine purring with well-maintained power. But starting the engine also announced her location to every soldier within a quarter-mile radius. She had perhaps 60 seconds before the maintenance area would be swarming with armed personnel determined to prevent her escape. Katerina gunned the engine and burst through the service doors at maximum speed. The motorcycle hit the service road while soldiers were still trying to process what they had heard. By the time the first shots were fired, she was already 50 meters away and accelerating toward the main gate. The gate guards had been alerted by the sound of the motorcycle, but they had not expected a direct assault on their position. Their defensive positions were designed to stop vehicles approaching from outside the fortress, not to deal with high-speed attacks from within. Katerina's motorcycle hit the checkpoint at over 60 miles per hour, too fast for the guards to adjust their aim effectively. Return fire sparked off the concrete barriers around the gate, but none of it came close to her rapidly moving target. She leaned low over the motorcycle's handlebars, presenting the smallest possible silhouette while maintaining maximum speed. The gate itself was partially open, designed to allow regular vehicle traffic, but the gap was narrow enough to require precise navigation at high speed. She threaded the motorcycle through the gap with inches to spare on either side, the engine screaming as she downshifted for the sharp turn that led away from the fortress. Behind her, alarm bells were ringing continuously, and searchlights were sweeping frantically across the surrounding terrain. But she was already outside the perimeter, racing into the darkness of the mountain forest. The pursuit began immediately. Vehicle engines roared to life throughout the fortress, and within minutes, multiple sets of headlights were visible in her rearview mirror. The hunters had become the hunted, but the chase was far from over. She knew these mountains better than the German forces, but they had superior numbers and equipment. More importantly, they had radio communication that would allow them to coordinate roadblocks and intercept her at choke points along the mountain roads. Katerina abandoned the main road after 10 minutes of high-speed riding, turning onto a logging trail that wound deep into the forest. The motorcycle's headlight illuminated a narrow path through dense pine trees, but she knew this trail from childhood hunting trips with her father. It connected to a network of paths used by local hunters and smugglers for generations, paths that didn't appear on any German military map. The pursuit vehicles couldn't follow her into the forest, but she could hear their engines as they attempted to establish perimeter positions on the roads that led out of the mountains. They were trying to contain her within a specific area, then gradually tighten the circle until escape became impossible. It was a sound tactical approach, but it assumed she would try to escape through conventional routes. Instead, Katerina drove the motorcycle as deep into the forest as the trail would allow, then abandoned it near a hunter's cabin she remembered from years past. From here, she would continue on foot, using survival skills learned during childhood and refined through years of resistance operations. The forest offered concealment that no fortress could provide, and she knew how to live off the land indefinitely if necessary. But before disappearing into the wilderness, she had one final task to complete. The intelligence she had gathered about the conspiracy was too important to keep to herself. Even if she died in the mountains, other resistance fighters needed to know the truth about their compromised leadership. Using a radio taken from one of the dead soldiers, she began broadcasting on emergency frequencies used by loyal resistance cells. Her message was brief but comprehensive. She identified the traitors by name, described the scope of their betrayal, and provided specific details about compromised operations and safe houses. She repeated the message 3 times, then smashed the radio to prevent the signal from being traced to her location. Within hours, her broadcast had been received by resistance fighters across the region. The conspiracy that had taken years to build was exposed and dismantled in a single night. Loyal commanders began the dangerous process of rebuilding their organizations around personnel who had not been compromised, while the traitors found themselves hunted by the same people they had betrayed. Colonel Kozlov and his fellow conspirators managed to escape to German-controlled territory, but their usefulness to the German war effort had been destroyed, along with their credibility among resistance fighters. The autonomous region they had dreamed of ruling became nothing more than a fantasy, while the resistance they had tried to destroy began the slow process of rebuilding itself on a foundation of verified loyalty. Katerina Volkov herself vanished into the mountains and was never seen again by either German forces or resistance fighters. Some believe she had died from exposure in the harsh winter conditions. Others claim she had escaped to Allied territory and continued fighting the war under a different identity. But her mission had been completed successfully, the conspiracy had been exposed, and the resistance survived to continue its fight for freedom. The truth about what happened to Katerina remained a mystery, but her legacy was clear. She had proven that even the most sophisticated conspiracy could be defeated by courage, skill, and an absolute refusal to surrender in the face of impossible odds. Her name became a legend whispered around resistance campfires, a reminder that sometimes one person with enough determination could change the course of history itself.